reducing pesticide usage is an important outcome from this sort of work. And as you'll see, vineyards in eastern Washington are very amenable to this idea. We have the right sort of environment for it to work well, and we also have relatively few pest problems. So we have a good situation. As I said, it's a great opportunity for habitat modification and conservation of beneficial insects in our viticultural ecosystem. It's not, our viticulture is not the same as Oregon's viticulture. All the things that I talk about today, particularly the native plants that we're using here, or we can use, could not be used in Oregon viticulture because their viticulture is more, is wetter. There's more natural precipitation and the environment is different. So it would have to be modified, the native plants would have to be modified to suit their situation, use the native plants that they have. So, we're utilising basically shrub steppe native plants that are home, this is their home. And what I talk about here, the native plants, could also apply to Idaho because they have in their viticultural system, it's a very similar environment. Some of the reasons why our system is good for increasing biodiversity is that we have few pests relatively. We're very fortunate in Washington viticulture to have far fewer pests than California has, for instance. They have at least 20 to 30 serious pests, and some of them occur year after year. Whereas we have a few pests, maybe 10, and most of those, well, all of those, are relatively, they're not key. There's no pest that occurs in every vineyard every year. They're sporadic. And so, not having a key pest that we have to control does help in what we're trying to do with habitat modification. And because of the relatively few pests, we have low pesticide input, particularly now compared to 20 years ago when we did still spray a lot. And because we have low pesticide input, it's more sustainable and allows biological control to work better, which is what we're trying to increase biological control by increasing biodiversity. So our pest management now is basically based on conservation, biological control, and soft pesticides. Pesticides are still used, obviously, but the ones that we use are generally fairly soft in that they don't wipe out everything. They're fairly selective, which is contrast to 20 years ago when the pesticides we used then tended to just take out everything in the vineyard, good guys and bad guys and everything. So we've gone beyond that. So we're in a good situation in our viticultural ecosystem. So, before vineyards, this is Red Mountain where I used to live before the vineyards came along. This is the landscape, what it looked like before we developed vineyards. And so you can see the native plants here, the flowering native plants, that in a lot of areas now in the Yakima Valley don't occur because we've pushed them out with agriculture. And so the native plants have reseeded, and the beneficial insects that are associated with them have also reseeded to the outskirts. And so what we're trying to do is readapt the native plants as best we can, which will help the beneficial insects have a better home in the valley as well. And if they're closer to the vineyard, they'll do their job better and quicker than if they're having to come in from a long way away on the outskirts of the agricultural area. So we've changed the landscape, we've removed the native habitats and flora, and the beneficial insects that are associated with them have also suffered. So the concept is, to restore native habitat, i.e. native plants, in vineyards, or in or around vineyards. You don't necessarily have to be in the vineyard, but just closer to the vineyard than they might be at the moment. They may be many miles away, nearest native plants. And so if we can bring them closer, then the opportunities for the beneficial insects that come with them are better. So there's two ideas to this: to provide refugia, sort of native plants around the vineyard, to provide home and resources for beneficial insects just around the vineyard, and also they're not mutually exclusive. We can do both. We can have ground covers, so that's actually bringing native plants into the vineyard in the rows, which is obviously even better, and that performs another function too. Of course, utilising that space in between rows that is now often weedy or dirt. This will, if we can have native plants as ground covers in rows, then we can have benefit from that space, and the beneficials be very close to the vines. So native plants is what we're focusing on because they are hardy and adapted to the region. There's been work done before we started doing this work, looking at the benefits of ground covers generally, using ornamentals or plants from outside the region, California or elsewhere. And it was demonstrated that they would help biological control, they'd help beneficial insects be closer to the vines, but it was hard keeping those plants alive in our hot, dry summers and severe winters. It was a challenge to keep them going. So a lot of time was spent on, replenishing them every year and keeping them alive during the summer. Those sort of problems shouldn't exist with native plants because they live here anyway, and they're adapted to our climate and environment. And they shouldn't need special attention and additional water. So it makes sense to find native plants that we can use. And as I said, they are a home and provide food to the natural enemies that we want to use in controlling pests in vineyards. They grew up with them, they evolved with them. So many of them had special relationships between the native plants and the beneficial insects. But when we began this work in, I guess it's 7 years ago, 2010, we didn't know which ones were best. There's obviously a great diversity of native plants that we could potentially use or encourage to grow near vineyards. But some are likely to be better than others in providing resources for beneficial insects. But no information whatsoever about this. So a lot of the last few years in our research lab has been spent looking at different native plants and their attraction to beneficial insects, which ones are the most important in terms of bringing in beneficial insects, and pollinators to some extent. We've looked at pollinators too. Even though pollinators aren't directly of importance to vineyards, they are part of biodiversity, and obviously in the wider scheme of things, pollinators have got a lot of press recently. They're very important. They are declining, and so if we can help pollinators within vineyards too, and I'll focus more on that as the talk goes on, then that's a good thing. So beneficial insects for vineyards, the whole range of beneficial insects. And a lot of the pests that we have are best controlled by beneficial insects that are not specialists, they're generalists. And a lot of these groups, lacewings, lady beetles, predatory bugs, beneficial flies, predatory thrips, parasitic wasps, a lot of them, most of them, will feed on the pests that we want them to feed on, but they'll also feed on other pests too. And so we're looking at encouraging an assemblage of beneficial insects, a community, not just one or two. And that's best ecologically, and that's how we get the best control of pest management if we encourage the community rather than specific natural enemies. So I think the next few slides I go through very quickly just to remind you if you know already, or to let you know which predators and which natural enemies we're particularly interested in. There's the predators that eat the pests, things like spiders, and then there's parasitoids or parasitic insects that parasitize pests. They get under the skin of the pest, if you like, eat from the inside out. And there's one there, there's a parasitic wasp. They're mostly very small compared to predators. And then there's the pollinators. As I said, it would be good to encourage them and keep them happy as well. So some predators, the praying mantids, which can be important in some situations, predatory bugs. So I'm just going to go through these, just a reminder of the sort of beneficial insects that we're trying to attract with our habitat restoration. Predatory bugs, like stink bugs, like the previous slide, they get bad press because some of them are pests. So there's the marmorated stink bug that we're on tenterhooks about. Hopefully it doesn't become a serious problem for agriculture in the Upper Valley as it has in the eastern US. Looks something like that. But there's a lot of predatory bugs, stink bugs, that are predatory, that are good. So, you can't dismiss all stink bugs as being bad. There's some very small predatory bugs, and this is only 1/10 of an inch long, but these are extremely important. You hardly see them because they're so small, but they're responsible for feeding on a lot of aphids, mealybugs, leafhoppers, mites. They do a great job, and they're not really known about. Ambush bugs, they sit on flowers and attack things that come pests or pollinators. They're not particularly fussy, but they're part of the community. Another shot of one. Minute pirate bugs, another small, tiny bug that you rarely see, but I can't overstate how important they are in controlling mites and leafhoppers and other pests in grapes. And yet, nobody knows about them, really. You can see them with a hand lens, you can see this characteristic sort of pirate sort of markings on the back. So you can see them if you know what you're looking for. And often they occur in large numbers. And then there's beetles, of course. They're mostly on the ground, and we did a survey of ground beetles in a vineyard some years ago. We were astonished at how diverse the fauna was. It's like 50 species, I think, we came up with that. Boxes full of all these beetles that we sampled from just one vineyard by putting pitfall traps out. And this was a spray vineyard, I think. So, we do have a diverse fauna of ground beetles, and they feed on caterpillars and other pests that are on the ground. Without them, we'd have far more problems than we have. Lady beetles are more familiar beetles, of course. They feed on aphids and mealybugs and leafhoppers. And then there's other lady beetles, like this tiny one here that's only pinhead size, but all it does is feed on two-spotted spider mite. That's all it lives on. And they're very well attuned to finding spider mite infestation, so they're usually the first predator to control spider mites. And we think the spider mites, predatory mites, are the most important, but actually these guys are just as important, and they're very sensitive to chemicals. So in the past we didn't really have them in the vineyards, but now we do. And there are plants that they like, in particular native plants. So they are an important part of our natural enemy fauna in vineyards. Earwigs, they've got mixed reviews because sometimes considered as pests, particularly in apples, but recent research has shown they do more good in apple orchards than they do than bad. So you can't underestimate them. They're good as well. Lacewings, they feed on aphids, mites and mealybugs. They're very sensitive to chemicals, so if you ever see these creatures in vineyards, you've got a good low input vineyard that's not too disrupted by chemicals because they're sensitive. Their larvae look like this, the mandibles at the front, attacking prey. Predatory flies like this robber fly that come in and kill things and fly out again. And there's other flies like this syrphid who larvae feed on aphids. This is slug-like creatures, a larva of the syrphid or hoverfly. So the adult is a pollinator, but the larvae are a biocontrol agent against aphids. We don't really have aphid problems in grapes. Probably one of the reasons is we do have good biocontrol by those sort of natural enemies. And then these fearsome hunting wasps that go around attacking things. There's a great biodiversity of natural enemies out there that we can utilise. This is a wasp carrying a caterpillar back to its nest for its larvae. And then there's the mites. These are really unseen unless you've got a microscope or hand lens to look at them. But the predatory mite is in the centre there. It's usually clear coloured or brown. These are the pests that they feed on, two-spotted spidermite. So these are very important as well. And they occur on other plants besides vines, of course. So and there's some plants in particular that they like and help them build up populations. Spiders, everybody knows about spiders. Lots of different types of spiders. Cool photographs here of spiders. Crab spiders hang out in flowers and attack the prey. But then parasitoids, which are mostly very small. This is quite a large one, half an inch size, but mostly they're just a few millimeters in length, like this one. But they're very important in parasitising things like leafhoppers and mealybugs and caterpillars, cutworms. So extremely important. Again, largely unseen because of their size. Most people don't talk about wasps, and people automatically think about yellow jackets or something big and fearsome, whereas most wasps are tiny and do a great job in biological control. And there's flies like this tachinid fly that looks a bit like a housefly, but it's got this bristly rear end. It's a very important parasite of caterpillars and some other insects as well. But then there's the pollinators, the bees that everybody knows about, the most important group. But there are other pollinators too, wasps, which are parasitoids, but they also act as pollinators as well. In fact, anything that visits a flower is a pollinator. Some visit flowers more often than others and are better designed to be a pollinator, but anything that visits a flower has potential to be a pollinator. This is the hoverfly again, this larva is an aphid predator. They are very important pollinators. And butterflies and moths are also important pollinators. Okay, so that's just an overview of the biodiversity of natural enemies that we're encouraging to reside in vineyards that are in the environment. And this is, we call this conservation biological control because we're just conserving the natural enemies that are already in the environment. All these natural enemies are common in the shrub steppe once you leave the agricultural areas. If you go to the top of the mountains in the Tri-City, Red Mountain and Badger Mountain, you'll find all these insects in quite good numbers, and Yakima, same thing. So they're all around us, but it's just getting them to the vineyard, to the more, in pesticide areas is the challenge. And what I said about the fact that our vineyards are less pesticides inputted than they used to be applies to agriculture generally, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the crop. But pesticide inputs have declined generally. So, and they will continue declining further. So everything that we're talking about now is the way of the future. With vineyards are a crop that we can do it in now because of our very low input, but other crops will also adopt this as their inputs lessen too. So if we come back in 50 years, habitat restoration and having biodiversity in agriculture will be the main thing. It will be, what am I trying to say? It will be something everybody does rather than just a small group of 14 people or whatever. So it's the thing of the future, and I believe that. But there's a lot to learn. And so, back in, as I mentioned earlier, we know that about 120 species of native flowering plants that potentially we could use, but we didn't know which ones were the most important. So we did a lot of trapping on native plants for a number of seasons and lots of traps, and 3,000 traps per season times by 4 years. So we've got a lot of data now, and still we've published some of it, but it's not all published. But we do have a good indication now of which are the best native plants to grow, to get better biological control, which is the main thrust of this work, because we're looking at trying to reduce pesticide usage, reduce costs of pesticide usage, and to rely more on biological control. So this graph just shows all the beneficials lumped together and the top 10. So it doesn't really mean that much because Well, it does mean a lot actually. It's all beneficials, but I'll show you more slides in a minute to show different groups of beneficials. So it varies, but really, the number one plant that attracted all beneficials, surprisingly to me to begin with anyway, is sagebrush. The plant that's out on the landscape everywhere that really nobody cares for, and even entomologists didn't think was that important as a plant for either pests or beneficials, turns out to be a harbour for the most beneficials in terms of numbers of individuals, not different types of beneficials, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. It just has a lot of parasitic wasps, basically. And so it is an important plant. And when you think about it, it probably makes sense because we're talking about the shrub steppe landscape, which is dominated by sagebrush. And if we were here 200 years ago, it would have been sagebrush everywhere. And so that's the plant that all the insects had to associate with, and a lot of them have developed a relationship with it. And so it makes sense in a way because it is the dominant plant on the landscape. But others there, the grey rabbitbrush, which is, I've got pictures of these in a minute, so in case you don't know what they are. I'll move on to the next slide, I think. Oh, there's the bottom 10. There were some that, the native plants, that balsam root, one type of balsam root, some clover, desert parsley, that really didn't attract many beneficials at all. So we were right in our idea that not all native plants are going to attract the same number. Most of them do. The bottom 10 were sort of an exception. Yes?
I have a question on how you trap those. Do you put the trap right on the plant?
Right.
So you have a number of these traps up in the plant.
Yeah, so all replicated. Clear traps, so if we put yellow traps on, they might be attracted to the yellow because the insects are attracted to yellow. So they're transparent traps, so they were seeing the flower through and smelling the flower or whatever. So so we're just intercepting the insects as they were attracted to the plant. Initially, all of this work is just the traps were put on the plants when they were flowering because we figured that the insects are attracted to the plants mostly for their nectar. But after we did all this, we did some work looking at some of the plants at times when they're not flowering, and to our surprise, found a lot of them actually attracted the same beneficials even when they weren't flowering. Sagebrush is a good example of that. Sagebrush only flowers for a few weeks in October, but it attracts beneficials throughout the year, particularly in spring and in autumn generally. So it's not just associated with nectar, which is good because if you're just relying upon the short period that they're flowering, you need a whole bunch of different flowers flowering at different times. So as I said, we're still analysing a lot of this data, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be flowering. So we started to look at different groups like lacewings and found that certain plants like serviceberry and pepperweed and buckwheat attracted more lacewings than other plants. And so the same for other beneficials. Buckwheat, and I'm going to talk more about buckwheat in a minute. And despite its name, it's not a wheat at all. It is, but not the buckwheat that we have here. So it's a confusing name. Common names are often confusing, and we should stick to scientific names. But the buckwheat's attracted to lady beetles, which is a native plant. And again, with the predatory bugs, another buckwheat. And as you'll see in a minute, buckwheats are important. Sagebrush is important for minute pirate bugs. So that's it seems that minute pirate bugs use sagebrush as a home for most of the year, not just when they're flowering. Beneficial flies. For some reason, Oregon sunshine, which is a small composite yellow flowering daisy, attracts large numbers of beneficial flies, swarms of flies. Anagrus wasps, which are very important in viticulture because they are the main biocontrol agent of grape leafhoppers. Sagebrush, as you can see from this graph here, it's just huge numbers of anagrus on sagebrush, particularly in the autumn, but also in spring We still haven't defined what the relationship is. We think they're using it as just a home during the winter, perhaps, but there may be alternative hosts on there too, other leafhopper hosts. We haven't yet looked into that. But whatever the reason is, sagebrush is a good reservoir of anagrous wasps. They do like living in sagebrush. None of the other plants come close to sagebrush. But other parasitic wasps, again, sagebrush, which is that one there, and rabbitbrush, which is very similar to sagebrush, but more attractive because it's got yellow flowers. Both are very good for parasitic wasps, and the buckwheat again, and milkweed, and some other things. More buckwheats. Actually, buckwheats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buckwheats occur. So you're beginning to get the sense that buckwheat is important. Again, with predatory thrips. We have as many predatory thrips as we have pest thrips. In fact, there's more species of predatory thrips. Thrips are a good thing. And even the pest thrips is sometimes predatory as well. And really doesn't. It's one of these very minor pests of grapes. In some other crops, it can be bigger pests. But the predatory thrips, again, buckwheat, clematis, more buckwheat, rabbitbrush, buckwheat. So some plants begin to appear in all the lists. So this is where we're going with, our recommendations for which native plants. And again, a specific group of parasitic wasps and sagebrush and buckwheat and rabbitbrush and buckwheat again and milkweed. Milkweed's another good one. I'll talk about more in a minute. So sagebrush. Hopefully you are all familiar with sagebrush. Everybody knows it, even if they're not aware of what it's called, and people don't really much care for it. First thing people do when they create a vineyard or build, start a vineyard is to get rid of the sagebrush. When really, and not just where the vineyard's going to go, but from some distance around, you should actually be retaining it. And this is the recommendation now to new growers clearing land. Keep as much sagebrush close by as you can, because it is a reservoir of natural enemies, and it's important to keep it nearby. As a refugia plant, as I mentioned, it seems to be used as a refuge by many beneficial insects, and as I said before, it attracts the greatest number of beneficials in terms of individual parasitic wasps and predatory bugs in particular. Flowers in the fall, but that doesn't really matter because, as I said, it's all year round. We haven't published this information yet, but we'll be working on it soon. But if it has one drawback, it's, of the groups of beneficial insects, I group them into 10 groups, and those ones I showed previously, the 10 most important groups, and only 5 of those groups are represented in large numbers attracted to sagebrush. So it's not attracting the whole big biodiversity of natural enemies. It's restricted to 5 of 10. But those 5, it's attracted a hell of a lot of them. So the diversity there, there's a sticky trap on sagebrush that you can see the numbers that are attracted there. It's flowering.
Did you, when you were collecting, did you notice any non-beneficial?
I'm waiting for that question. No, not in significant numbers, no. Thrips is probably, the pest thrips is probably the most numerous thing that we collected on all the sticky traps. And that applies to all the native plants we looked at. There's no native plant that stood out as being a big attractor of leafhoppers, for example, or anything else that we're concerned about in grapes. So yeah, it seems to be good from that point of view.
So the attractiveness of some of these plants to the parasitic and the beneficial is not because they're loaded with unbeneficial or
No, they've been attracted because of either the nectar or volatiles from the plants that is attracting them for what other reasons. Yeah. So there's sort of diversity. 50% of attracted insects are wasps. Well, actually no, because you've got anagrus here, separated anagrus, because they're so important for grapes. So that's more like 80%. And it's just, in fact, it is also wasps too. So it's just parasitic wasps and predatory bugs, and that's despite the small share of the pie. It is important because of the minute pirate bugs being so important to viticulture. But it's basically wasps, small parasitic wasps being attracted to sagebrush. Rabbitbrush, which is more familiar to people because of the yellow flowers, is almost as good as sagebrush. And it's better because it attracts a wider range of beneficials. I don't have the pie chart up there, but it attracts a wider range. And yeah.
Is that all through the season as well with Rabbitbrush, or is that mainly towards the fall?
I haven't analysed the data yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it probably is, but I can't say for sure. Okay, so Oregon sunshine I mentioned earlier is attracting a lot of flies, and so this is a small low-growing plant that has potential as a ground cover. I think we may have looked at it briefly as a ground cover. Not sure about the results of that yet, but it's very good for beneficial flies. But the beneficial flies are not necessarily something all viticulturists need. There aren't many beneficial flies that help control the pests in the grapes. But certainly attracting a lot of pollinators as well. And some wasps as well, but it could have potential as a ground cover. Western clematis is a climbing plant, so that'd be a refugia type plant in nearby areas. And it does attract a wide diversity of beneficials from 9 of the 10 groups. So this is a plant that before we started the work, I used to see it climbing over other vegetation and think it looked pretty ugly, but it's actually very beneficial in terms of attracting beneficial insects. And the flowers are attractive, it's just that when they go to seed, they produce this white seed heads which gives it its other name, which is old man's beard, and that's what we see around now. And so it doesn't look very neat to many people at this time, but it is a very good refugia plant for attracting beneficial insects. Slender hawk's beard is another one that's good at attracting flies mostly, and its potential as a ground cover. Buckwheats, as I mentioned, they're not wheats, obviously. They're a native plant in the genus Eriogonum, and we have 10 to 12 species just growing locally, and they're desert plants, really. They're adapted to hot, dry conditions, but they have this great appeal to beneficial insects. And some of them, like this one, are quite attractive as ornamentals. And in fact, there's actually an Eriogonum society, would you believe? Google it if you don't believe me. So a group of people that are actually keen on Eriogonum plants, just naturalists, and go out and have a conference on Eriogonum and field trips because they're just into these plants, and there is a market developing for gardens, ornamentals using Eriogonum buckwheats. But our interest is the fact that they do attract a lot of beneficial insects, large numbers of a wide range. Again, big diversity. We have 10 species, as I said, and they're either spring, summer, and some are actually fall flowering. The one species is only just finishing flowering right now. So this is one called Northern Buckwheat, and there's the diversity again. Wasps feature prominently, but flies and ichneumonids and the other groups are there. So good diversity. And this is another one, this is the snow buckwheat. This is very common in the Tri-Cities end of the valley, and this is the one that flowers late in the fall. We're actually looking at it as a potential ground cover. In fact, a number of these we're looking at potential ground covers because they are fairly low growing, attract a lot of beneficials, and they're tough. I think you can run over them, you can mow them, and then they're going to come back. Most of these plants I'm talking about are perennials, by the way. It's one word I forgot to mention. That's another key factor in what we're trying to do, is find something that is going to replenish itself, not something you need to worry about reseeding itself. It's going to come up from the roots every year, at least for a few years, and reseed as well, of course. But so that's an annual. A lot of the old plants that we used to look at, the ornamentals, were annuals that needed to be sown every year.
Well, these buckwheats, if you use them as a ground cover, do they grow together fairly well since they're mostly kind of clumping plants, or?
Yeah, we're still working on that. We're doing trials of the ground covers with buckwheats, but so far it looks pretty good. They do grow together well. You're right, in the native habitat they tend to be more separated in clumps. But some we haven't looked at all of them, but some of the species are doing very well closely with each other. Just growing alongside each other. But ultimately, we'll probably, if we develop a ground cover, when we develop a ground cover commercial, to recommend, it will be made up of more than one plant. It will be buckwheat and something else perhaps. But yeah, all those things we're working on at the moment. So the native buckwheats, and if any of you are interested, we did write a paper on it a couple of years ago that I can send you a PDF of. It's a scientific paper, but it's fairly understandable, I think. And it just shows which are the best buckwheats and draws attention to the fact that they are important as beneficial insect attractants and good candidates for ground covers, not only in grapes but other crops too in our environment. This wouldn't work in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, of course. They probably don't even occur there, I don't think. But certainly in Idaho they would work, and other similar dry areas. Buckwheats occur throughout the western US, and there's more in California, so they could certainly use them in California as well. And as you can see from the flowers, they all look slightly different. They're all fairly attractive. I guess I'm biased to sort of become an Eriogonum person too. I'm not a member of the society yet. I haven't. But the other interesting thing is that they are hosts for other creatures like butterflies. And I actually became an entomologist because of butterflies. I was the 8-year-old kid with a butterfly net and knew I wanted to be an entomologist. There aren't many entomologists like that around. People that actually knew they wanted to be an entomologist. Everyone else sort of came into it by some other method. And so butterflies are close to my heart, and I still study butterflies, and so I know Eriogonums, buckwheats, as being important for butterflies too. So if we're talking about increasing biodiversity in a vineyard and creating mini nature reserves, and that's not such an impossible dream, then buckwheats would be a very important part of that. They are caterpillar hosts for butterflies that are on the screen here, plus half a dozen others in our local area. And so if you have buckwheats in your vineyard, you have the potential to actually have breeding populations of the blue copper butterfly and the green hairstreak and the Morgan nettle moth, and other butterflies too. So something else, another attribute of it. So this is some shots of the vineyard trials of WSU Prosser, and this is parsnip buckwheat. And so you can see they're not very old, but they're sort of growing fairly close together there. And this species has done better than I ever thought, because it doesn't seem to grow in the valley. It's more on the outskirts, but it's very happy in the soils of the valley where we've tried it so far, both in Prosser and in the Tri-Cities. And its persistence and replication have been above expectations. And so this is definitely one with great potential, parsnip buckwheat. And
Question, Jim.
yeah.
How do you establish that? I noticed you had a drip line there. Do you transplant those? Or?
Yeah, for the purpose of our trials, just to determine which plants are going to be the best, we use plugs. We just use young plants, and we irrigate them in the first year. No irrigation after that. And so these plants, they've all done extremely well afterwards. And this has all happened in the last few years when we've had really hot summers, and so they've had the real big test in surviving without water. We only gave water in the first year just to make sure we had plants to evaluate, but thereafter no water at all, and they've done extremely well. Ultimately, of course, once we develop a ground cover mix, we want it to be seeded, and you can get buckwheat as seed. So, all these things, it's definitely practical and commercially possible, whereas 20 years ago it wouldn't have been. These plants wouldn't have been available to anybody, but now they are. And the people that are producing them are happy to, if we say that parsnip buckwheat is doing really well, I know at least 2 or 3 native plant producers that will focus on those plants if they think they can sell more of them. Seeding will be the way to go in the future. So that's northern buckwheat, which is also performing very well too. And slow buckwheat, we've only just started working with that, but that seems to be, like the other buckwheats, doing well. And a lot of our trials in WSU property land unavoidably gets either accidentally mowed or cut or sprayed or whatever, and not watered or whatever. All of the plants have withstood all this abuse pretty well. So WSU is a good place to have abuse in vineyard trials. And now we're beginning to look at trials in commercial vineyards once we know which plants to go with. And then there's another buckwheat too. So there's a whole bunch of buckwheats that we will definitely be in the mix at the end of what we decide upon. This buckwheat's a bit different from the rest because it grows taller, so it's probably more suited as a refugia plant, but it attracts a huge number of beneficials. Probably, I think it's number 1 amongst the buckwheats. So this is, though not a ground cover, would be good as a plant nearby to the vineyard. The question I often get is how close do these things need to be? They don't have to be, within a mile, within 500, half a mile, quarter of a mile, is sufficient for a lot of insects that we're concerned about. A lot of them can fly good distances, and a lot of them will turn up in vineyards even though native plants are miles away eventually. A bit late, but they will turn up eventually. So the whole point of this is to get them earlier. So if the plants are only half a mile away, a quarter of a mile away, that's not a big deal, and the natural enemies will turn up in good time. Because a lot of them, like anagraris wasps, are wind-driven anyway, float on the breeze. But others guide themselves, and they're all pretty good at finding what they want over fairly long distances, within a mile. So moving on to another plant, and like the buckwheat, yarrow is another one. This could be number 1 actually. When we started this work, I think one of the reasons I started it because I saw it being grown in New Zealand of all places, in vineyards down there. You might have seen it out there. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure if they actually grew it or it's just a native plant that was, because in some wetter climates it can be weedy. But anyway, it was in vineyards and around vineyards, and it was just covered in beneficial insects. And from my butterfly work, I knew that it attracted a lot of butterflies too. In fact, this slide was taken in New Zealand, so it's a New Zealand butterfly. So I figured that yarrow was going to be something that would have potential. And sure enough, after the research we've done, it attracts a lot of beneficial insects. And in our vineyard ground cover trials, it's one of the best in surviving and drying thick stands of itself and continuing year after year. So maybe it's a mixture of buckwheat and yarrow. Yarrow is probably going to be in the mix at the end. And it's easily purchased right now as seed. And in fact, a lot of people, and the other thing with native plants is that a lot of people now are working on native plants for their use in restoration schemes. And so we know a lot more about the cultivation of them. I mean, I'm not looking at cultivation and how to actually, trying to grow them in vineyards from plugs, but there is information out there now on how to seed yarrow, for example, and even how to seed buckwheat, the best times and best treatment of seed, all those sort of things. So the information is becoming available, and you could probably go out and use yarrow right now if you wanted to, and have the best information about it. It's a summer flowering ground cover, as I said, predatory bugs, flies, parasitic wasps, a wide diversity of beneficials. In the first year we had 97% plant survival, so you can see how thick the stand is there. And you know, it's not going to be weedy in our climate because it needs a bit of moisture. And so it's not really going to escape from the vineyard, but it will survive without moisture. This is probably, I don't know if it's the first or second year, probably the second year actually. So it wasn't getting water. So it will come up after the winter rainfall very thick and then struggle a bit as the summer goes on. But it will flower early, and maybe that's where the buckwheats come in, you know, because they're slightly later flowering. So if you had buckwheat mixed in there too, you'd have flowering for a longer period of time. And in this, actually in this study, even though it's in small plots, we already showed with the yarrow, it was attracting greater numbers of beneficial insects on the grapes adjacent to the yarrow, in the yarrow blocks or plots, even though they're very small. So it's promising.
Is the yarrow, is that nitrogen fixing?
Good question. I don't think it is.
Yeah.
But you know, those sort of things, I don't think everybody knows enough about that, because we found that some of the plants that we're working on are nitrogen fixers. I can't remember which one it was now, but yeah, there's not much information available. So for yarrow, I think we would know if it was. But some of these other plants could be nitrogen fixers, and we don't even know that yet. So, showy milkweed, you probably all know milkweed as the host plant for monarch butterflies, and that was its main claim to fame. But our work has also shown that it also attracts a lot of beneficial insects from 8 of the 10 groups that nobody realized before. And so, again, we have a publication on that, and I'm happy to send a PDF of it if you want, showing that it's great for wasps and flies and bees, of course, and butterflies and other beneficials, predators and parasites that we're concerned with. So it's not simply a host plant for monarch butterflies, it's also an attractant for many types of beneficial insects. And we have a lot of milkweed in this area, unlike a lot of parts of the US. Stinging nettles, they are important too. My history with stinging nettles goes back to when I was a 10-year-old boy living in England with the butterflies, because a lot of my butterflies fed as caterpillars on stinging nettles. So I was particularly interested in stinging nettles at that time, because I knew that they supported butterflies. And so here I am, many, many years later, looking at stinging nettles, and we found that they are good for minute pirate bugs, beneficial flies, hopper flies in particular, and also parasitic wasps. You get larger numbers of these beneficials in stinging nettle patches than away from stinging nettle patches. And again, we have a publication on that. So having a patch of stinging nettles, as well as providing resource for butterfly, certain butterflies, is also helping beneficial insects. And you know, nettles are fairly common in the valley. And so, you know, instead of, but something else, something that's usually got rid of because it's a weed, but it's actually a weed that's actually doing some good. And it would be a good idea to leave them. And these are the butterflies that we have locally that feed as caterpillars on stinging nettles. So encouraging biodiversity using stinging nettles. They have a particular relationship, the nettles, with minute pirate bugs that we haven't determined. In fact, there's a particular species of minute pirate bug that we know from work done at USDA at Wapato that seems to be associated with stinging nettles. So, you know, nobody knew the value of stinging nettles. It was just got rid of because they sting. They don't look very good, but they are a good resource for biodiversity. Lupines, a native plant that's attracted to beneficial, particularly parasitic wasps and also butterflies, so particularly blue butterflies there. On Red Mountain, where vineyards occur now, there used to be fields of lupines and blue butterflies. They've now retreated to the top of the mountain and on the other side, so they're still there, but where they used to be, they're not anymore. But if those vineyards use lupines, they could be easily returned to where they were just 15 years ago. Willows, they attract a lot of beneficial insects and also larval hosts for the butterflies down there. So they're another useful riparian plant. And chokecherry is another one that's very good for beneficial insects, and it's the host plant for the large tiger swallowtail butterfly that you see throughout the valley. And I know that chokecherry is a plant, even though it flowers for a short period of time, it does attract beneficials throughout the year. So it's another good recommendation for an area of plants that are close to a vineyard, not in it. Spreading dogbane, we're struggling in getting this to actually grow in the valley. We haven't given up yet, but it really is, it's ranked second behind sagebrush in total numbers. So it is very important at attracting beneficial insects. We may not be able to get it to grow very well here, but if we can, it will be a great thing as a ground cover, because it's very low growing. So we haven't given up yet on that. Coyote mint, it's another one, it's a native plant that attracts lots of beneficials. Again, we're having problems with keeping that going. So there's a practical side to this. Some of these native plants are good for beneficials, but they're not so easy to grow at the moment. So they may end up not being something we can use. Goldenrod is another important one for beneficials, is a refugia plant, and western hyssop too, similar. Purple sage. So you may recognise some of these plants or not. I mean, they are common all around the valley, even if they're not in the valley. Purple sage is a very robust and drought-tolerant plant, and very attractive too, and attracts a lot of beneficials. So, there's a combination here of aesthetics and benefits, I guess, beauty and benefits. Some are more attractive than others to people. There's the Oregon sunshine again. Blanket flower is something that some agriculturalists are already using down the gorge. I know there's at least one grower, I'm not sure if he's I don't think he's a grape grower, but he's got a field of blanket flowers as a pollinator resource that he's trialing. And we're trialing blanket flower as a ground cover in vineyards, and it certainly is tough and attracts beneficials. Another daisy type, fleabane. Anyway, so I could go on and on about the different types of plants, and we looked at 120, and probably the top 50 had benefits.